Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the New York Studio School. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Heather Ewing, and I'm an associate dean here. Happy summer solstice, and we're so happy to have you here with us. And we're also very honored to be collaborating with our colleagues at the Glass House and also Historic Artists' Homes and Studios program of the National Trust. And a special thanks to Valerie Ballant of Haas for her support of this event tonight. We really appreciate it. Come on up. I just wanted to take a very quick moment to introduce you to this National Historic Landmark building that we're in. The Whitney Museum of American Art opened here in 1931. And before that, the 4 row houses on 8th Street and the 4 stable block buildings on MacDougal Alley, which comprise the studio school, were cobbled together by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney in the early decades of the 20th century and called the Whitney Studio Club. And it was a space for artists to have studios, some living quarters, and also exhibition opportunities. And she also obviously collected and supported them, and that was the genesis of the museum when the Metropolitan Museum of Art said no thank you when she went to them with her 700-piece collection. And we're all the better for it. So anyway, this space, which we're honored to steward, has been the site, these skylit spaces throughout the building have been the site nearly continuously for a century or more of artists making and talking about art. And so we're very glad to continue that tradition here. This room in particular is the site of our evening lecture series during the academic year, and we invite you to join our mailing list to come back every Tuesday and Wednesday nights here. We have free lectures that are open to the public. After this program, downstairs in the clay room, another great space in the building, there'll be a reception. And I also invite you all to come see the jewel of the building, the Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney studio, with the Inferno fireplace by Robert Winthrop Chandler and the spectacular ceiling and everything like that. So that's accessed off the clay room, and we'll do that after the program. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Lustbader, who will take you off for the first.
Thank you. I should just say in the interim, before I start officially, I have my own notes here that it has a queer history itself, this building, and it's got a prehistory that Malvina Hoffman, the sculptor, she worked out of 17 MacDougal Alley in 1907. Bruce Butfield was the interiors designer. Robert Locklear did the trompe-l'oeil. Buford Laney, he had a studio in the museum in 1931, and the Charles Demuth Memorial Exhibition was held here in 1937, 1938. And it also has in its collections Marston Hartley and Georgia O'Keeffe. So that is, in some ways, how, I'll get into it in a bit, the work that the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project is interpreting sites. So, I'm Ken Lustbader, co-director of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, and we were launched in 2015 to document a largely untold yet vital part of New York City's diverse history through the built environment. And I want to thank the Glass House team and the Haas for sort of co-sponsoring this, and the New York Studio School for hosting this event. In advance of tonight's panel, I'm going to provide some context and background about the study of LGBTQ site-based history. And by the end of tonight's talk, we will have a better understanding of the importance of exploring and interpreting queer sites. We were founded in 2015 by preservation professionals to document the cultural heritage of the city's LGBTQ community through historic buildings and landscapes. We not only recognize LGBT site-specific history, such as the widely known Stonewall Inn down the block, but also the community's influence on American culture, such as this building. Our website features a map with almost 500 sites in all 5 boroughs from the 17th century to the year 2000. And as you can see here, we are preservationists, so we classify the buildings and resources by category, and you can then attach a statement of significance to all those buildings and filter it on the map. So it is quite an extensive launching point for people's explorations of LGBTQ history in New York. Because the map is somewhat unwieldy and got bigger and bigger, another way to explore this is through our 36 curated themes. Our project asks questions like, where did LGBTQ history happen in New York City? In what buildings did influential LGBTQ activists and artists live and work? And on what streets did groups demonstrate for their equal rights? Excuse me. When we started the project, only 2 sites were listed on the National Register specifically for LGBTQ significance, and the register is the federal government's list of resources deemed worthy of preservation for their historical significance. Since then, we've been involved in the successful nomination of 12 LGBTQ-associated sites, and that includes the Alice Austen Gertrude Tate residence, which will be discussed tonight. But that is a drop in the bucket when you consider that there are more than 100,000 sites individually listed on the National Register, and as of today, maybe I think 32 are specifically listed for LGBTQ associations. One goal of our project is to broaden people's knowledge of the city's LGBTQ history and how the public benefits when we tell these largely untold stories. So by making an invisible history visible, we can embed LGBTQ narratives in tangible sites with the intangible benefits of pride and identity connected to the past. But why should an LGBTQ association matter? For example, this is a painting by Paul Cadmus. Paul Cadmus and Jared French moved into this house on St. Luke's Place as lovers in 1935. They were joined by French's wife, artist Margaret Honing, in 1937, and the 2 men continued their own relationship with each other. So if you see this painting by Paul Cadmus, Greenwich Village Cafeteria, which depicts Stewart's Cafeteria, which was a queer hangout at 7th Avenue South and Christopher Street in the 1930s. Many of you may know it, it's an Art Deco building where the subway lets out. You have to understand that this is a gay man depicting a gay space. And you have to look at that space and see the man going to the bathroom with that come hither look as he's enticing the viewer into the bathroom with him. So why should I call this out? Well, simply put, when we study the history of straight artists, we study their public and private lives, the lives of those individuals, their intimacies, their relationships, their friendships, and their creative output. We delve into their inner lives. Why shouldn't we do the same with queer artists? By interrogating their queer lives, we're able to have more nuanced and broader understanding of their homosocial worlds, their work, their friendships, their creativity, and how their queer connections influenced each other and their artistic output and work. But identifying and pulling these narratives out of the closet is challenging. Too often the stories are relegated to the classification of spinsters and confirmed bachelors. Some of the challenges include a limited concept of LGBTQ site-based history and historic context, limited amount of documentation, the archival record is often destroyed and we're dealing with a hidden history, changes in terminology from periods of time. Alice Austen would never call herself a lesbian. Stakeholders may not be familiar with evaluating LGBTQ sites, and funding for research and interpretation is always a challenge. And then we come to the question of where is the proof? We don't require proof when someone is heterosexual with the need to document what they did behind closed doors. In her book, The Queerest Places, author Paula Martinack succinctly says, the very idea that we need proof assumes that being queer is wrong and that to accuse someone of homosexuality is a terrible thing to do. So when investigating the queer past, we have to devise an alternative detective system. Because the LGBT community has had to hide for so many years, many of the rules of evidence don't apply. For example, heterosexual marriage and children would not necessarily rule out that someone was gay. Sometimes there's a need to also rely on rumor, and gossip, which has been called the oral history of queer people. So as you will hear tonight, we have made great strides in the reinterpretation of historic sites that have queer associations as more and more institutions, house museums, Agencies embrace new historic narratives using the built environment, and there's a growing number of studies and reports focused on LGBTQ site-based history. We're working on a survey now to build an informal network through virtual conversations that will be taking place in July to connect people throughout the country doing this work. If you want to know more, please email me. And thank you for this opportunity, and have a meaningful Pride. And I'm now going to introduce Victoria Monroe of the Alice Austen House. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on this very, very hot day. My name's Victoria Monroe. As Ken said, Ken is an amazing colleague and mentor, as are all of the members of the LGBTQ Historic Sites Project. I have been the executive director of the Alice Austen House since 2017. I started work with the project in 2015 to write women's history programming for the house, which they weren't currently teaching at the time. At that moment, I really discovered the house. So I first visited the house in 2008, and I was doing a tour of Staten Island. You can hear my accent, I'm from New Zealand. I feel very at home at the waterfront. And I was loving this park, and I went into this house, not knowing anything about it. I think I stayed inside for about 3 to 5 minutes. When I left, I didn't know that Alice Austen was a photographer, and I certainly didn't know she was a lesbian. So as a queer artist that worked with photography and curated exhibitions, that would have been really meaningful for me. So when I was lucky enough to, by coincidence, work with the education director at the Alice Austen House and be hired to write programming, I discovered this incredible story, and I can't talk to you tonight about queering the museum without talking about Alice. Alice, you see here, looking incredibly fierce in her striped dress, and then with her life partner of 55 years, Gertrude Tate, 30 years of which were spent living at the house. Here's Alice and her friends, Julia and Julia. They had incredible senses of humor, but she had a really bold and noticeable and distinct artistic style. Notice the placement of the umbrella. And here, 3 in a bed, and 2 of her other friends posing. These are all included in the permanent exhibition that is now on display at the Alice Austen House. So, one of the things that's so important to recognize about Alice Austen is that she created safe spaces for her and her queer friends. Largely, it was circles of lesbian women, but she was also friends with gay men as well. What Alice did was move inside Victorian society and be a real part of it, but then utilize activities that were available for women to do that weren't chaperoned by men. So she created these clubs, the Staten Island Bicycle Club, the Staten Island Garden Club, all of these activities that her and her female friends could be together and be undisturbed. And this is the Darned Club, one of my favorites. I don't have enough time to talk all about these things tonight, but I just wanted to give you a taste for those of you that may not be familiar with Alice Austen's work. Just the incredible quality, the intimate nature of it, and it's expansive in so many other themes. Here's the image that you will be presented with in the hallway as you enter the Alice Austen House today. And that's Alice perched on a lamppost, Gertrude looking out at the photographer with a really knowing expression that this is Alice, her unconventional self. She also was bold and ventured to photograph quarantine stations and the people on the streets of New York. So to come back to the LGBT Historic Sites project for 1 minute, they were incredibly important in us achieving our amendment to our historic designation, our landmark designation, to include queer history as an area of significance. And that happened in 2017, which was the year that I was lucky enough to take over the lead role at the Alice Austen House. For me, I fought tooth and nail for that position. I realized how important it was for a lesbian to lead the museum after all these years. We'd been open since 1985, and in our initial opening, the team, just prior to that, the original Friends of Alice Austen House, they fully acknowledged Alice's lesbian identity, and they wanted us to be a living, breathing photographic museum. So that got lost along the way. But having this designation given to us in 2017 was a real impetus for us to do the work. So when we received the designation, we weren't currently programming the museum at all for LGBTQ folk. The only thing we were doing was allowing same-sex marriages on our lawn and charging a lot of money for it. So our lesbian community recognised the importance of Alice Austen and pre-Stonewall history for them way before anyone was actually doing the work at the Alice Austen House. And it's not to say that other executive directors before me haven't tried to tell some of this story. So in 1994, the Lesbian Avengers protested on our lawn, and currently this year, so wonderful, we have one of those protesters' photographs on display as a part of Photoville in the meadow. And in 1976, the Darn Club graced the cover of Dyke Quarterly. How they even got that image, I think they secretly photographed it while they were on a visit to the Richmond Town Archives. I have talked to the designer about this, and she can't remember how she came across it, but it's wonderful. So we were doing really passive programming at the house, kind of mimicking some of the images, and then receiving this designation. Ken is in the photo, and that is Joan E. Byron, who has become one of my most stalwart mentors. And when I said about the LGBT Historic Sites project being, the site itself is like an area for mentorship, but getting to know them and doing that work is really important. So what was really important to me was to work with older lesbians that had been leading the charge to have this interpretation come to fruition at the Alice Austen House. And so it began in 2018. Now, I just wanted to show you really quickly, this is the house that I toured. There was 2 period rooms. This was one of them. This had one photograph of Alice Austen's on display of a tree. She didn't own any of this furniture. Alice and Gertrude were evicted in 1945 from the property, and so all of the possessions were lost, sold, went out into the world. So these were all antiques that were brought in in a well-meaning way, but did they tell a story? Did they connect with visitors? Absolutely not. So today we're able to use our tiny, tiny spaces to kind of squeeze out every bit of interpretation from all of the themes in Alice's work. And, we can bring students into the room. They're not roped off anymore. We don't have Alice's voice either, aside from notations on photo sleeves. But we have the voices of her friends. We have an incredible letter collection that we've translated and made available online. So this was the first step, was transforming the house. This was the original parlour, also barriered off. You couldn't walk in. 3 of Alice's photographs on display. Now we have vitrines. We do have some technology. I've kept it at a minimum, but I'm using voices from the past and the present, so scholars from the present as well, to tell this story throughout all of the text in the exhibition. And now active storytelling, because that's what's really important to us, is connecting it with the present. We are a historic site. We are a house that was built in 1690. Yes, you can come here for the architecture, but you're going to actually learn about this story today. We teach over 6,000 students. We have over 20,000 visitors. In my first year, I was the only full-time staff member. We now have 5 full-time staff, which is just, it's a passion project. It's my second house. And we have 14 staff total. We're able to launch incredible, exhibitions that really help continue this story, connect us with our elders and our present colleagues. And so, I'm just so incredibly proud to do this work. And last June, we launched our Queer Ecologies Garden project. So we are queering the landscape now and actively moving to other sites to be able to grow what is beyond the walls of this small historic site, actually taken down all the fences of the park, so we are a park without borders, to be correctly inviting the entire community to enjoy this space, and consistently working with queer groups to be able to help them direct and preserve their archives. So thank you. I hope I kept your time.
Good evening. My name is Abby Baer. I'm the executive director at the Demuth Foundation. Disclosure right off the bat, in Lancaster we say Demuth. So I will try to say Demuth. I know a lot of people, if they're familiar with his work, outside of Lancaster, it's Demuth, but in Lancaster, it's Demuth, and there's a story behind that. Don't have time to tell it, but I'm happy to share it at the reception if you'd like. So we recently underwent a pretty elaborate reinterpretation project. Our mission at the Demuth Foundation is to promote the appreciation and awareness of the visual arts in Lancaster, and we do that through 3 ways. We preserve Charles Demuth's legacy, we support local and regional artists, and then we also inspire the next generation. The foundation formed in the early 1980s, and since that time, the building, which is circa 1760, different rooms and galleries had sort of been added to the footprint of the museum and renovated. But, there was never any kind of cohesive vision. And then the other thing about our museum is that you could come and actually not learn anything about Charles Demuth or see any of his work, which is kind of weird. So we decided to kind of flip that model, and basically, instead of having most of our space be temporary rotating exhibitions, we are now focusing a lot on permanent collection and Charles' story, and having a small room now for our temporary rotating shows. So why did we decide to reinterpret? We wanted to use the space better, as I kind of mentioned. There were elements of Charles Demuth's story that were never addressed in a formal way, including his sexuality, as well as disability and disease. He had diabetes, and that really impacted his life and his work. And as I mentioned, we weren't really meeting expectations, especially for out-of-town visitors who would come to see our museum. They would get no content about Charles Demuth. This process is 4-pronged. So we started with research, which took about a year. Then we did some planning. Implementation was really only about 4 months, and we're now in the evaluation phase. We reopened our galleries in April, so this is very fresh for us and a very new endeavor. The research. Throughout this entire process, we really wanted to tell the full story of Charles Demuth. We wanted to center the narrative on the artist. And we had never done that as a foundation. And so while it really wasn't Charles Demuth coming out, it was the organization sort of coming out in a really public way. And so we wanted to do this with transparency, and we wanted to do this with the posture of listening and learning from one another. we worked with a couple different people and consultants, the first being Susan Ferentinos. She is excellent. She literally wrote the book on what we're trying to do, interpreting LGBT sites. And we asked Susan a couple of questions and to give us a report about it. We asked her to kind of look at what a gay lifestyle for early 20th century American artists would look like, and how did that present itself in different communities that Charles would have lived in or worked in the country. We also, we talk about evidence. Our audience still wanted evidence. And so we did ask Susan if there was any evidence, how could we explain that? Interestingly, we learned through this process that no evidence is actually evidence, because a lot of times that material would have been destroyed because of social and criminal penalties at the time. So she put out a beautiful report for us, but she's a public historian, and she didn't know a lot about Charles Demuth's art. So we asked curators and art historians from across the country that were familiar with his work to pick one piece and then interpret it through an LGBTQ lens. And some of them also were able to incorporate disability and disease in their interpretations. And so we have that sort of compiled into different essays. And then the last part of our research process was actually internal. We contracted with our local YWCA for a gender and sexuality training for our staff, because we wanted to, as a group, learn how to talk about these issues. We wanted to have common vocabulary and terminology. We wanted to get comfortable with this so that when visitors came in, we could explain it to them as well. We also worked through the ethics of, historical outing. There is a lot of conversation around it, but, we really evaluated the fact that Charles Demuth did not have the tools and the support and the language to really fully embrace his identity in the 21st century lens, but in the 19th and early 20th century lens, the means that he had available to him, he was expressing his sexuality. It's already really widely discussed pretty much everywhere but Lancaster, that he was gay, and it gives us a lot of context to understand his artwork. So there has been a shift in art history. A long time ago, historians and curators wouldn't necessarily have considered a person's sexuality, characteristics, other traits as part of the interpretation of an artwork, but that started shifting in the latter part of the 20th century, and so we're kind of catching up a little bit with that. If you're interested in any of that research, I had mentioned transparency. We have it all published on our website for people to go read, and we even recorded a presentation that we had where there was some Q&A. So that's all available for anyone to access. When we finished with the research, we identified 4 themes of what we wanted to talk about in our reinterpretation. And the question we came back to is, why do you have to visit Lancaster, Pennsylvania to see Charles Demuth's work when you can go to the Met and the Whitney and all of these other wonderful museums to experience his work? The first was place, obviously being in Lancaster and seeing how the place itself inspired his work is really important. The second is medium. He was a master watercolorist. Most of our collection of over 60 pieces are watercolors. When you go to major metropolitan museums, they may have the watercolors as part of their collection, but rarely are they on view because they are a little problematic to show. So we wanted to really talk about watercolor. Personhood is Charles Demuth's individual characteristics and his experiences that impacted his artwork, and that is where the LGBTQ narrative came into play. And then impact, why is his work important and why are we still talking about it? Planning, everything was sort of developed and written in-house. Myself and another staff member, we wrote in all the content. We felt that we were most familiar with it, really intimate with the information, and wanted to have that be something that was generated in-house. But we did work with consultants. Our framework, I had talked about the space. We really wanted to think about the look and the feel of each room, how much time people were spending. Because we weren't really talking about Charles Demuth, they were blowing through in 10, 15 minutes. And we wanted them to dwell and spend time with us. And also outcomes. What did we want them to think, feel, and do as a result of being in our space? At the planning phase, we worked with another consultant, Margaret Middleton. They were incredible. We specifically asked Margaret to help us think about how to better incorporate the LGBTQ themes. And they came up with a narrative plan that walked us through each space. One of the big takeaways from working with Margaret is we had these 4 themes, and we have kind of 4 rooms, and I thought, okay, this room's gonna be place, this room's gonna be personhood, this room is, and it was gonna be very compartmentalized and linear. And thinking about Charles Demuth's queer life, it wasn't compartmentalized and linear. It was integrated into everything he said and did. And so we were able to kind of think about how to do that with Margaret. And they also pointed out opportunities to talk about queer community that I would not have necessarily had at the forefront of my mind. Implementation, as I said, we just did this in April, and these are just a few photos. We do have a collection of Charles's work, but it is mostly works on paper, so we can't have everything out all at once. And so we thought about other tools and pieces that we had that would be relevant. Charles's father was an amateur photographer at the turn of the 20th century, and we're fortunate to still have some of his plates. And so that's just one example of how we were using his images, the things his father actually took to center it in place. This is an image he took from the top of a church steeple right behind the property. Social sphere. A lot of times people might not be familiar with Charles Demuth's work, but they know a lot of the people he did know, like Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz. And we wanted to talk about some of those people. I mean, this wall, there's room to expand, and we probably will at some point. But it gives us a great basis to have special exhibits, have special programs around some of these other really influential artists. A lot of the folks on this wall are also queer, and so we can talk about how their relationships and worlds intersected. The studio, when we decided we wanted to do a reinterpretation, we were initially thinking it would just be this room, and then the more we got into it, we're like, this is not a one and done kind of thing. We have to redo the whole space. So it is partially recreated to what it was like when he was in the space. Some of these are artifacts he actually used and touched. Others are things that we were able to sort of replicate based on the records. But also in this space, we talked about other communities, other queer communities he was in. And that included New York and Greenwich Village, at Provincetown, Paris, and Philadelphia. And we also have a panel that helps our visitors really think about code. It is explicit in some of his paintings, and then in others it's not. And one of the things that the historians and scholars that worked with us on the project really helped us to understand some of that code. And so we were really fascinated how he expressed his sexuality in not only his artwork, but also his writing and his dress. And so, we talk about that to visitors now. And it is something that folks really seem to value and catch on to. It all started actually with a grant for our research from the National Trust for Historic Preservation to tell the full story. But we were able to get other funding from both public and private sources. The total project over a little over 2 years cost us about $250,000. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but to us it was. For perspective, our annual budget is about $500,000. So we were devoting a lot of time and resources to getting this right. And so far the response has been wonderful. If anything, people have asked for more. They want to hear more about Charles Demuth's queer life and what it was like for him as an artist in Lancaster. And so Victoria's been at this a little bit longer, and she's got a lot of those programs going, and now we're sort of in the process of doing that. In fact, tonight is one of them. Bert Savoy, who was a performer, did a lot of drag. One of Charles's most famous paintings of calla lilies was a dedication to him, and so we're doing a little exhibit around Bert Savoy and drag. So we're in that process as well. And I think that's the end. So Kirsten is next.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Ryak, Executive Director at the Glass House. Most of you may be familiar with the Glass House. Maybe you made the trek up to Connecticut to see it, but maybe you haven't, and so I'm just going to go through some images to give you an overview. Completed in 1949 by architect Philip Johnson. This was really his weekend house. He had a modern apartment here in New York City. It was the first international-style glass-walled residential structure in the United States. It was certainly referencing contemporary design by Mies van der Rohe that would become the Edith Farnsworth House, but this was the first one that was completed. Johnson at the time was mostly known as a curator at MoMA, but he had recently graduated from Harvard's architecture school, and he wanted this country home to retreat to. And in 1946, he was drawn to New Canaan by other young architects that were starting to settle down and create these mid-century modern homes for their families and their clients out there in Connecticut, because New Canaan was a place that they were allowed to do this new architecture. The group would be known of these architects as the Harvard Five, and they and others would wind up building almost 120 modernist homes in Little New Canaan. Johnson started with 5 acres, where he built his glass house and his brick house, which was a guest house. The glass walls allow the surrounding lush landscape to become a wallpaper, really, and a decoration for the occupants, and it constantly changes throughout the day and throughout the year. Across a courtyard is the brick house. It's a counterpart. It is the opaque to the transparent. It's originally a guest house, but then it really became a place for privacy for Johnson. It balanced the yin and the yang of that site. This has just been restored and reopened after 15 years after extensive water damage, and I hope that you'll come out and make the trip to see it. This pairing was soon joined by the pool there on that original 5-acre lot. And then over time, Johnson bought more and more land around him and built more and more structures and features. From the original purchase in 1946, he went on to purchase 10 other parcels of land, thereby preserving both his views and his privacy. It allowed him to build additional structures, and in no particular order, I'm just going to flip through some, like the painting gallery in 1965 to house his extensive collection of paintings and photographs, most of them all modernist artists. The sculpture gallery, added in 1970, inside of which you can see Frank Stella's, Bruce Nauman, Robert Morris, Klaus Oldenburg, really like a vast open space to house large sculptures. He added a studio and library in 1980 as a place where he could work without being distracted by everything outside the glass house. And then he could also house his collection of books on architecture from ancient times to postmodernist. And his last building was De Monsta from 1995, inspired by the work of Frank Stella, which was originally meant to be a visitor center up near the road and near the gates to the property. As you may have noticed by now, over these decades, Johnson, and over the course of his life and his career, he moved from that modernist international style all through neoclassicism and then to postmodernism, as you see here. So this site was a place for him to work out ideas and materials and try things out. He also designed a number of follies scattered across the estate, including the Pond Pavilion of 1962 and the monument to his friend Lincoln Kirstein in 1985. And in this folly, you can see him working through the designs for the New York State Theater in Lincoln Center with the arches and the white masonry. He also added outdoor art to the site, such as this Donald Judd sculpture, among others, and slightly nerve-wracking installations like this handrail-less bridge that one must use to traverse the site. This slide also gives a good sense of the multitude of traditional stone walls, some of them over 200 years old, but the ones up at the street in the background have been extended in order to keep this privacy. This is a place for him to retreat. And now we have 49 acres with 14 different structures. And the significance architecturally stems from both the innovative design of the glass house and the estate, and the body of work and influence of Philip Johnson himself over a very long career, as he kept working well into his 80s and 90s, it was influential until his death. And if you read the National Register nomination form of 1997, you may believe that this is the sum total of the significance of this site. Because there's no mention of the social history or of anyone other than Johnson in relation to the glass house, even though the author was able to work in, and the author of the designation report was able to work in Johnson's fascination with Nazism in the 1930s, his being a proponent of fascism here in America. He could work all that in, but he was never going to be identified as gay in this official document. But Johnson's identity as a gay man never has been in question. And his partner of 45 years at the Glass House was David Whitney, a very important art collector, art curator, and an art dealer in his gallery. If you read the designation report of on the National Register, it reads as if it was just Johnson alone there. They had been a couple since meeting in 1960 when Johnson gave a talk at Brown University and Whitney was just a student at RISD in the audience. And more than that, the Glass House had an important role as a place where Johnson and Whitney together welcomed their artistic friends and where they could have weekends in the country hosting salons. It was not just a retreat for this couple, but also for their friends, especially in the gay community of which they were a part in the 1960s through the 2000s. The site was physically marked by the men that they invited there, mostly men, with structures like Johnson's Lincoln Kirstein Tower as a dedicated artwork to his best friend, who was also a co-founder of the New York City Ballet. There are many works of art by the men that are listed here, and other artist friends, and famous 1967 country happening where Merce Cunningham danced, you can see him there, to music by John Cage and a concert by the Velvet Underground. Perhaps the most frequent guest was Andy Warhol, who was very close friends with Whitney and Johnson, and they were instrumental in fostering and encouraging his career and were collectors of his art. And so you can see him early in their friendship and all the way through his career as well. Sometimes Warhol seems as much a part of the site as Johnson and Whitney, especially during the recent restoration of the Brick House, where the bedroom is inescapably associated with Andy Warhol. And the painting gallery features his portraits of Philip Johnson. By the 1990s, Johnson was publicly out in press, in society, and he had already made arrangements to leave the Glass House to the ownership of the National Trust for Historic Preservation for public tours and programs. Johnson died in January 2005 at the age of 98, and Whitney died just 5 months later at the age of 66. The Glass House, just 2 years later, opened to the public in 2007, and welcomed, at that time, about 7,000 its first year, and today, about 14,000 people a year. I only joined the Glass House staff about 9 months ago. But staff who have been there for a very long time have told me that the role and true significance of David Whitney was slow to be communicated by guides on tours. If tours started in 2007, it was around 2011 when David Whitney started to be a regular feature of the tours. Until actually quite frequently, the frequently asked questions for tour guides said, one of the main questions was Philip Johnson ever married? And the answer is no. Full stop, no explanation. So I'm glad that progressively tours have become much more open and honest and given greater depth, and the mission has been updated to reflect, as the National Trust's mission also does, to the full American story. But there's still a long way to go. In recent years, our curatorial team has made an effort to reflect the significance of the site in queer history and culture through our contemporary arts programming that we offer to the public on the site and elsewhere, such as performances, a performance by Gerard and Kelly in 2016, which explored themes of queer intimacy and domestic space within the legacies of modernist architecture. At the Glass House, the artists were particularly interested in how the house sheltered and protected an elite group of queer creative figures. This project was cited by the National Park Service's 2016 survey of LGBTQ historic resources. Then in 2017, we featured Jimmy Roberts' Imitation of Lives, which was a dance performance centering on race and queer identity, focusing on two images, the Glass House kitchen photo from 1950 with a black butler, and a photo of Harlem Renaissance cabaret singer Jimmy Daniels, who was romantically involved with Philip Johnson in the 1930s. In 2019, we had an installation titled Gay Gatherings, focusing on Johnson and Whitney's relationships with the individual gay artists that visited most often and had become identified with the Glass House. And just this spring, we hosted a talk on the social history of Philip Johnson's guest house. Clearly, this is an ongoing process of ensuring that we're accurately portraying the importance of the Glass House in LGBTQ history through our tours and programs, and having honest dialogues about this with our thousands of visitors. And so this is something that we're still developing for sure. We also have a responsibility to be active in the community. This is the first year that the Glass House has participated and supported the fledgling local New Canaan Pride. We put out the flag, and I gotta say, these are rare in New Canaan, and if you know New Canaan, this is something that's also a process, but it's happening. And it's time for the National Register nomination form to also recognize this significant part of this story. There's only one other in the whole state of Connecticut, one other site that is listed for its importance as a queer identified site. I think that there's got to get some momentum, and so we're right at the beginning of that process. So we're looking to other sites, as you've heard today, to give us that kind of information and guidance and direction as we move forward in this process. So thank you.
Thank you for these really informative snippets, I'm sure, because there's so much more content to include, sort of overview of what you're doing. There are so many house museums, so many artistic houses, there are so many sites throughout the country. I think of Vizcaya in Florida and Miami that clearly, are conflicted with how to reinterpret their sites. You've talked about the benefits, but I'm curious have there been personal and professional unanticipated benefits to the community and to you for the interpretation of these houses that you didn't even think would happen when you began?
So many. No, it's been an incredible journey, both because we are a platform for contemporary photographers, so really providing more space and place to contemporary queer artists, forming those intense friendships, like I said, the mentorships, and really then taking the charge from sort of achieving this interpretation at the house, which has meant an entire change of my board. I have a wonderful board member here tonight, from a board that was very homophobic and resistant to doing any of this work to a board that completely embraces how and why we're doing this work and allows me to do it. But then also providing this kind of avenue to help protect other lesbian archives and meeting those women and those people, and connecting them with the right kind of places, like you were saying, making these connections, talking to you at the very beginning of your process, and now talking to Cole also at the beginning of the process. It's collegiality, which is something I value so much and I think is so important in the museum profession, but moreover within the LGBTQ community. I feel really proud to be able to, and privileged, to do the work. Does anyone else want to answer that? Or?
Yeah, I would add to that too. My staff and I actually had a Zoom with Victoria before we really even started it, because we didn't really know how to do this work, and she was incredibly helpful. But one of the interesting benefits to me that I have found is visitors that have come in, whether they're familiar with us or not, and we had a welcome guide that sort of explained the reinterpretation and why we're using the word queer now to describe Charles Demuth. And people would pick it up, and some folks would be like, well, I don't care, what does that matter? And then on the way out, they would stop and they'd say, I get it. It's important. That's a part of the story, and I see how that connects to his work and his life now. And that is just like, we finally figured it out. And with board, we've had past board members come in and look around, and maybe a little skeptically, and then say, this is the way it should have always been. Why didn't we do this 25, 30 years ago? So I think that the benefit is that we're finally able to connect the dots for people and connect the community to the true person of Charles.
I would, I'm still very new at the Glass House, but I think that it was always in arts circles associated there was never a question. So I don't know that we're bringing it out in that way. I do see locally how it's making a difference for us to be much more out and vocal in Connecticut and in the New Canaan community. So I do see that, but I'm very much cognizant of how our guides are having richer discussions and dialogues with our visitors as they become more comfortable, and developing that queer narrative that you were saying, like really having that information to give to your docents is so important.
I could add actually a disadvantage too. So part of it is at the front entrance of our building, we've added a little sticker in the window and a little pride flag in our planter, and that flag keeps getting swiped. And so we have come up with creative solutions. We have taped it now into the inside of the planter. That didn't work. So now one of our facilities person has greased it with Vaseline. So if anyone else is having a problem, that is a solution, and it has stopped the stealing.
I think it is also wonderful when you're talking about docents and then also board members, as you bring these people along, that you're able to enrich their lives and have them confidently say the word lesbian, like, wow, that took, 3 years to achieve. But it's really amazing. And doing this talk tonight, it was like, oh, I haven't talked about this in a while because we're so at a different place of active programming. So it's interesting, when I sat down, I was like, oh, I could have said that.
Well, and it's interesting because the Glass House, clearly Johnson was out and had a relationship and people knew. So, but now you're flipping the architecture to the inside of the intimacy of that life. And these other examples are based on house museums that are not, the architecture was also there, but the level of discovery has got to be immense. But I think that when you look at the Darn Club, that photo, when you look at On That Street, which is the watercolor that Abby depicted, where it's three men basically in their backs encircling each other. It's in Sand Street in Brooklyn, and it was a queer cruising spot. They were queer, these people. Like, it's so obvious to others. So the interpretation is valuable. And, what you're doing, the queer history sort of just got started in the 1970s, 1980s. Place-based history for queer sites didn't get started until the 1990s early. So you are all on the cutting edge of this, because this has been talked about for decades, but no one has been doing anything. So it's really wonderful to have these examples here. I'm going to shift to sort of the nuts and bolts of how do you do this. You talked about $250,000. You talked about the amending a National Register nomination, and I know you've been in the thick of fundraising. Has there been a disadvantage or advantage to sort of mold the LGBTQ narrative as a fundraising angle that you distinguish yourselves from other museums across the country competing for hard-sought funds?
So we did it on a similar budget, but when I inherited the project, it was some way in and money had been spent, but nothing had been done. So it was even more precarious. However, I guess the dollar signs for that original set of board members I inherited, like, made them accept this designation and say, oh, okay, we'll take it because we'll get money. But you're not going to get the money unless you actually, it's not just about changing your permanent exhibition. You have to write it into all the programs. You have to be very specific, whether it is teaching a class of pre-K kids or whether we're teaching, an adult workshop on the weekend. It is queer. If you are doing a water ecologies program at the Alice Austen House, it's queer. Okay, and so really, really stating that and designing programs that are fully integrated, but also making the effort to teach other people to integrate LGBTQ history is what funders need to see, because you will only get so far on the funding bandwagon for this. But yes, it is an avenue for funding, but you have to be prepared to do that work, and you also want to work with specialists that are broader than maybe these few people that are like, oh, we'll pull in this person and that person. You want to train your staff. Our education director's here tonight, phenomenal. We also have another educator sitting right behind her, amazing. They can carry that torch further because it can't exist in a vacuum with me or a few people, and that's where the funding, it's a call to action. But it's not easy. Does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I would agree that there are specific funding avenues for this work and that will only fund this type of work. 2 of our grants that we got through the process were given to us because we were doing LGBTQ research and history and narratives. So I agree that there's...
They won't repeat funds.
No. They, one of them actually I think would repeat for programming. They've actually reached out to us and said, okay, what else do you have? And I'm like, okay, dust is still settling. Let's get, the next ideas going. But I think for the most part, it's a one and done.
I would say there's a lot of encouragement and support from the National Trust for Historic Preservation now to tell difficult this is not a difficult story, but there are difficult stories from my side, but to tell things in a very honest and truthful way that all America can see themselves reflected in all the different aspects of our sites, and there's many across the nation. So I find that is supported, and so fundraising, if we're going down that road, is could come through that. I do still find though that there's board members or donors who will say, that's a very adult topic. And I'm like, no, it's not. I'm not talking about sexual acts. I'm merely talking about this couple and their identities, and yet there's still resistance. And when that comes from donors or board members or things like that, then that is something that you've got to break through. And information really is key to it all.
The students are already talking about it, so you might as well present the information correctly and have an accurate, authentic conversation around it. Margaret Middleton, her background actually is in children's museums, and so we kind of selected them because we thought they might be able to help us. And I didn't show any slides, but we created 3 sort of children's specific nooks within the museum with activities for kids so that it is very family friendly and welcoming. And so far there have been no issues.
And it is interesting to hear you say that about certain board members or such that won't fund, because you will lose some funding as well. Yeah.
Well, Senator Salos, I got an email yesterday from someone who said looking at LGBTQ criteria for significance is irrelevant. It's like looking at any other thing such as skin color. And I wanted to send, this is a National Trust advisor, I wanted to send them to Brent Leggs and look at they're preserving African American churches throughout the country. So, it's insidious throughout this. I think it's 7:35. I wanted to turn it over to the audience if there are questions, comments, feedback. Mm-hmm.
This is a very specific question for Victoria, just because I've heard a couple presentations now by you, which is this sort of next phase of queering the landscape. And I just like, everybody has a landscape. I mean, Abby is in a more urban environment, but certainly Kirsten has a pretty extensive landscape. I'm curious if you can sort of unpack what you mean by that term.
Yeah, so this is something I'd been wanting to do for years, and it took years to get any funding for it. It's kind of currently unfunded in a way, but there's avenues. So last year I was able to launch the Queer Ecologies Garden Project. That's a garden that is at the rear of the Alice Austen House, and all the plants are non-binary, they're self-seeding, they're intersex. They also are flowers and plants that have specific significance to queer history, such as lavender and pansies. But the really important thing that this garden does, well, it's two-pronged. So, Alice Austen was the founding member of the Staten Island Garden Club. It creates safe space for queer people. It acknowledges this history of gardens and queer culture, cruising culture, all sorts of things like that. But very importantly, it challenges heteronormative language, which has been imposed on us and on the plant world. And so with our students, we teach, one of our largest programs is working with Gender Sexuality Alliance students. And, we're able to bring them into the garden and actually really affirm their various identities through talking about these plants in this way. So I'm hoping to grow that project and extend it, and I do have funding now to extend it to a larger native pollinator garden. So it's very exciting. It's a new field, and that's what I would have liked to have talked all about tonight. But I know it's important to talk about the nuts and bolts of how we got there. So yeah, it's an exciting project, and it has its own website now. So it's a growing resource of queer ecology.
That's brilliant programming.
Hi. I was wondering, of course, I think all of you are doing amazing work, and in a perfect world, everyone would be in support of it. But have you had to think through security measures for, to protect the artifacts that you have, to keep the people that are in your space safe, and to make it a really welcoming environment? And have you had to, sort of think through planning, for the worst and hope for the best, given some of the climate right now?
So I just want to start off that about 2-3 weeks before our reopening, there was a really traumatic event in Lancaster involving actually our local library that was having a drag story hour, and a lot of protests and things that happened leading up to it. As precaution, the library had dogs come in and sniff, and of course they hit on one of the packages, and basically all of the downtown was shut down on a Saturday because of this. And this is weeks before we're reopening. So I started to panic because I hadn't necessarily thought about a lot of security for our reopening. But we quickly pivoted. We actually had the local police department come in and sit down with us, and we talked to them about what we're doing, and they were really supportive. And we hired some additional security for our initial reopening. So it wasn't so much artifacts, it was more our people, and it went smoothly. There have been no further problems, but it is something that if we were doing this again, I think I would have wished I thought of that sooner.
Hello, thank you all so much for this. My question specifically, is it Kirsten or Kirsten? Kirsten, hi. I'm actually here because I went to the Glass House for the very first time, like 3 days ago, and we actually went to the Alice Austen House like 2 days before that, so kismet. And I'm wondering, I learned about Philip Johnson's history as a gay man while I was on this tour. I thought it was so interesting, and then, I also ended up hearing a little bit about his bout with fascism, for example, right? And it kind of threw me for a loop, and I wondered, hearing about how someone's sexual identity and who they are as a person and all their queerness helps you understand their art, or in Philip Johnson's example, their architecture, just kind of what they do. You also have to then learn about the other parts of their life and grapple with that as well. So that I'm wondering, from y'all's perspective, if something comes up about this artist or this architect that just feels like that must come out as well, what do you do?
Well, we're being honest about every aspect of his particular history, and to me, I think it's all the more relevant in America today to talk about young men who are attracted to fascist leaders. So actually, I'm quite encouraging on our tours that our educators talk about these things. We also have education programs with the local high school where a civics class can actually deep dive into it and go through the FBI files and everything. So I feel like, you can't be honest about one part of a life and not be honest about both. And I think that there's value in both. I mean, some people will say, no, we got to just close it down, or stop talking about it because I don't like what you're talking about, or I don't like that aspect. But that then also would backfire on the very honesty of the topics we're talking about tonight. You can't pick and choose. And so that actually is kind of the part of what I really actually like about it. And I'm glad that the guides spoke openly with you on your tour, because I know that I think years ago I was there, and somebody at the end of the tour, after being David Whitney was referred to on the tour, and they talked about his partner, there was a question of, wait, he was an architect, so was this an architectural partner? Because partner is such an ambiguous term in the life of an architect, and to me that means, all right, we got to be more open, more honest in that context.
Thank you.
Did you have a question? Hi, thank you all so much. As we look to the future of the field and the museum field, you hear a lot about queering the museum, decolonizing the museum, and undergoing these projects in the museum that for some museums is sort of antithetical to what the museum is. And I'm really interested in the power of these smaller institutions to undertake projects that larger institutions, say the Met, or even MoMA, and even to some extent the Whitney, are unable to undertake just by the nature of their size and their acquisition policies and things of that nature. And just wondering if any of you could talk to what you see as being the power of the small museum to undertake these projects, and why they seem to be more successful at the smaller scale.
Mm.
I think you answered your own question. It's like, as I said, when I started, I was the only full-time staff member. So who's going to do it, right? And it was a complete passion project. So bringing these wonderful other staff members along, it's like, we're scrappy. We're the little museum that could. And so as long as you have really open leadership and you have a leader that is willing to collaborate with others, that's what's really key for these like really strong interpretations that can be models for others. And then it's about sharing, right? It's not just about, yay, we've got the successful project, come see it. It's like me talking to you. It's talking to Cole. It's talking to other people. It's also giving of your time to, I'm on the board of Historic Artist Homes and Studios, and I'm the board president of the Museums Council of New York City, which includes the MoMAs and includes the Met or what have you. And little spaces can do. And we're part of a much bigger network, with the executive director of Historic House Trust here tonight, the former executive director of Historic House Trust is here tonight. So it's a network of 23 houses. So it's really about coming together and not kind of like being like, I'm going to do this all on my own, right? I mean, the work, just you bringing all of these sites together, I feel like makes this happen.
I think a lot of what is here is based on individual activism on some level. My story is that I wrote my thesis on this topic of gay and lesbian history in Greenwich Village in 1993, and I was told, what are you talking about? So 30 years later, here we are, which is humbling for me that there became this field of study and exploration that through those efforts, we're here tonight. And I think that these efforts then are informing other museums on how to reinterpret their sites. And this is just not locally, nationally, it's internationally. The National Trust of UK is also reinterpreting a lot of their houses for the same reasons. So again, this is, it's Pride Month, activism works. And here we are as an example, so I'm hoping that this filters up rather than, it's not from the top down, this is all bottom up.
And we're very accessible, so reach out.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's one in the audience. And if not, we should go downstairs for drinks. Oh.
I'll close with a comment. I hope that there is a list, because this is not, I'm focused on New York, of sites that need to be identified for reinterpretation that could be focused on and advocated for. So that's just my wish to leave everyone here with that in the house museum world. So thanks.